what I'll be going over is Ratchet and Clank's 40 frame per second mode, or the 120 hertz performance RT mode. So let's sort of dive into this. Insomniac recently updated Ratchet and Clank with a new performance mode, and they've done this actually in the past with Spider-Man Miles Morales, and they did it with Spider-Man base game, where they added in, originally they had released the game with only two modes. There's like a performance mode and a quality mode. The quality mode ran at, or targeted 30 frames per second and a dynamic 4K resolution, but it was at the highest fidelity. It had ray tracing at the highest quality settings, and a bunch of other effects that, gave it more realism and a more rich 4K output. The 30 or the performance mode was a targeted 60 frames per second and largely nailed it. And then it had an even more dynamic or variable resolution that actually targeted more like 1080p, 1440p range. But it did not have ray tracing, and a bunch of other effects were taken out. At some point afterwards, they had decided to release, or realized they could release, a performance RT mode, which was a mode that targeted 60 frames per 60 frames per second, a lower resolution, so I think it was more consistently at 1080p, but it also had a lower version of the ray tracing found. So you were still able to enjoy like real-time reflections and the sort of realism that brings to like a dynamic cityscape. It just rendered it at a lower internal resolution, and they were able to cull more objects from the reflections that you may not notice when you're flying by it at whatever speed Spider-Man flies at. So this was a neat turn, and not a whole lot of people expected it, especially that early on, that they were able to pull out a 60 frame per second ray tracing mode. So we get Ratchet and Clank a couple weeks ago, and they had come stocked with those three modes as the main ways to play the game. So this is all well and good. We get a lot of options as gamers, and depending on the type of TV you have, you get a performance mode that suits your style of play. If you don't mind less, or if you are okay with less responsive gameplay, but the most vibrant image you can get, the richest image you can get, you would get the quality mode. Or if you just had a TV that wasn't capable of doing 60 frames per second, but 4K, that was the one for you. But if you preferred more responsive control and a more smooth gameplay experience, you might have targeted or gone for a 60 frames per second performance mode with ray tracing or not, depending on the amount of resolution you wanted. But we're in the space now where there's plenty of TVs that are available that can do 4K 120 hertz. And if you have something refreshing at 120 hertz, you get a more responsive feeling game, because you get updates in the visuals at whatever the corresponding rate is. So how could you get 120 hertz without like seriously compromising on visuals? What Insomniac figured out was there is a happy medium between 60 frames per second performance mode and the 30 frames per second quality mode, but also allowing people with 120 hertz TVs to actually enjoy this. So what they came up with was a 40 frames per second 120 hertz performance mode. It seems like a weird refresh temporarily, right? It's not what we are commonly used to dealing with, but they can do this with 120 hertz TVs because it's 40 is divisible, or 120 is divisible by 40. So it pretty much allows you to have 3 cycles, refresh cycles before you get a frame update. And then on top of that, you also have on a lot of TVs frame interpolation that helps smooth this out even further. There's been some look into this about like how much of a smoother experience does actually give you, and sort of looking at the comparisons between 30 hertz, 40 hertz, and 60 hertz modes, and there actually is a very, very clear difference. So what does this mean for games? This is like another sort of technical cheat that has fallen into the developer's tool chest. It's the type of tool that allows you to get a lot more performance out of a console that's hardware limited, but still perform at what the display technologies are at. So like games that need to present at a 4K resolution, that's extremely expensive. You can use artificial intelligence and render natively at 1080p and get to 4K without having to sacrifice the CPU or GPU overhead to get there. Likewise, this is sort of like a same sort of cheat technique. It allows the developer to target a 40 frames per second rate, which is below the 60 frames per second rate. Gives you the fidelity that they can squeeze out of it, but gives you the smoothness that you'd expect from a 120 hertz experience. And I suspect we'll see more of technical cheats like this coming out in this generation. Usually within a console generation, there's all types of efficiencies that are gained over the course of one console generation that allows certain graphics rendering that was impossible at the beginning of the generation. It makes it possible by like the late part of the generation. It's usually because they find new ways of like rendering things or new compression methods. And in this case, it's working within the first, couple months of, or half a year of a new generation. So it's super cool. And in some ways, this might be a real game changer, at least for people who own 120 hertz TVs, in the way they can be experiencing games. They get the benefit of a faster and more responsive game that you would get with a 60 hertz refreshing game. You get still high fidelity graphics that maybe aren't at a 4K resolution, but are somewhere between 1080p and 4K. And you get the smoothness that you'd expect from a 120 hertz TV.